Yeah, I'll tell you, thanks to every one of you here today who are part of this session. One of the things I say before all the different sessions that we do on taxes is there's no tax advisor knows every single country or every single instance in the world. So whatever your situation, it's really important to make sure, especially if you're dealing with significant amounts of money or significant risk exposure, to speak to your local tax advisor, basically. So I'll be able to give you some ideas, some high-level approaches. I see, Claudia, you're from Portugal. Great, yeah, nice to meet you. I'm over in Cascais near Lisbon. And I would say to any of you that are here in this community, if you ever happen to be by near Cascais in Lisbon, please let me know. It would be great to catch up for a coffee. But in any case, let me share my screen and go straight into the presentation. So we have, let's just come to it here, 1 second. So work is not a place, but taxes are. That's going to be the subject of today's discussion. Just showing you some pictures of our journey. I tried to personalize a little bit. This is our little family. It's my wife Dee and myself. We've got Rosa here. She's the famous one. She's the one that's 5 years of age, been to 24 countries. Then Esme is the COVID baby. She's just turned 3. She's been to about 3 countries. And then Bara is he's our youngest. He's just almost a year old. And here we were in Phuket in Christmas visiting an elephant sanctuary. Highly recommend it if you ever get a chance. So what are we going to speak about today? Please let me know if there's any feedback, if you can hear me okay, if there's any problems, or if I am speaking too fast. I'll try and, one of the challenges with Irish people is we tend to speak very fast. So I'll try and make sure I don't speak too fast in that case. But what are the topics that we're going to speak about today? 5 key topics, and it's essentially going to be talking about what are the main risks of tax around work from anywhere or digital nomadism, and then how do you manage these, either for yourself personally or as a startup, and give you some inspiration about where this is all going to go in the future. So before I do that, I just want you to go on to mentee.com and use this code, because I want to understand more about all of you, where you're all from and how you're thinking about this and what you think the biggest risks are. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, but basically if you could go on, you should see an inspirational co-working space in Kavasi in Bulgaria. So I'll just give you all just 20-30 seconds just to get that done. If you have any problems, feel free to mention it in the chat. When I go on to Mentee, you'll still see that code in the top in case you can't, in case you manage to miss this. But yeah, basically what happened was, in the meantime, is we were planning on going to Thailand for 5 weeks for December and January. And we didn't even have Ireland on the list of countries that had visa access. It was added at the last minute, but then we had to get basically the whole COVID test. We managed to get those okay. But in the meantime, my daughter Rose ended up getting chicken pox. And of course, you can't travel with chicken pox. And thankfully, she recovered just before the flight. And literally, the day we were flying, there was Storm Bara, the biggest storm of the year in the UK and Ireland. And thankfully, lots of flights cancelled, ours weren't. So I think it was a bit of an entrepreneurial kind of a risk-taking to get over there, but it was fantastic to be able to get over there. And I cannot recommend Thailand enough. I don't know if any of you have been there. Feel free to share in the comments. But in the meantime, I'd just like to go to the first question. I'm going to ask you a poll, and it's the country that you call home. So I'm always conscious of asking this question. Sometimes we ask people where are they from, but some people view that as a tricky one to answer, particularly third culture kids. But I'd like to ask you all, if you go on, let's see where you're all from. I'm guessing a lot from Germany. Yeah, fair enough. Very good, nice little mix. Okay, a lot of German-based people here, where you call home. I actually studied in Passau for a year, and I have a brother in Germany in Munich, so great memories there. We see a lot of, let's say, digital nomads from Germany traveling around the world. It's a fantastic passport. So, okay, Germany, we've got the Philippines, we've got Portugal there, Spain, UK, France. Okay, great, excellent. A nice mix. Next question. If you could work remotely from one country in the world, where would it be? And while you're answering that, one of the things to watch out for is, from a tax perspective, Germany is actually very, very strict. So I'll be sharing with it in the presentation, but you know, some people have this concept that you can be completely location independent from a tax perspective. That's really, really, really tricky to do. And certainly countries like Germany are very, very strict in it. So this is interesting here. So most people are from Germany, and yet if they could work from one country in the world, it would be Germany. It would be their home country. So it looks like we have a number of home birds here, people that really love being close to home. Spain, Thailand, of course, Indonesia. I'm guessing Bali is going to feature very, very highly there. Cabo Verde, I haven't been, but I know Gonzalo Hall has been talking a lot about Cabo Verde. Would love to go there. Mexico as well, very, very popular for a lot of Americans. Good to know. Okay. So then the next question I'm going to ask you is last one. My biggest worry when it comes to work from anywhere. So when you want to work remotely internationally, if that's for a couple of weeks or months or even for a year or two, what is your biggest worry? Is it individual tax? Is it corporation tax? Is it employment law? Is it data security and privacy? Is it visa and immigration? Or is it something else maybe that we haven't mentioned? And for me, it's good to hear what you're sensing and what you're feeling is the biggest risk so that we can then address it. I think one of the things that we're very lucky with in Europe is that we have we've got the Schengen area, we've got good visas, gives us visa-free access to lots of countries. But if you're not from Europe, obviously that's a bit of a pain point. I'm guessing that's why that one person clicked visa and immigration. But clearly, what do we see here? Well, individual tax for us as individuals is a big pain point. Corporation tax, yeah, clearly from a company perspective, if you get it wrong, you can trigger all sorts of corporation tax risks for your company. But this is good. It's a good feedback to get so that we understand the audience before we kick on. So going back to the presentation then, let's take a look back in here. Thank you for that. So the first section is really just for me a call to arms. And, you know, I think a lot of us who've been locked up in, you know, with COVID, we haven't been able to travel. And then all of a sudden, you know, COVID has started to open up. And I think we've seen already for domestic work from anywhere, how it represented a value shift in all of society, where the CEOs of many companies said it's time to go back to the office in the middle of last year. And essentially, there was in many ways a revolution. There was the Great Resignation. There was a lot of people saying, you know, my values have shifted during COVID. I'm going and I'm looking at things differently. And that's one of the things that we could see for domestic work from anywhere or domestic remote work. But one of the things for me, and I'm kind of trying to be an advocate of, is the opportunity offered by work from anywhere. So international remote work. And this is one of the examples. This is a spectacular co-working hub right by the beach in Kavasi in Bulgaria. I haven't been. I certainly know from the Instagram photos that I'm extremely keen to go. But if you think about it for a second, if you can be, you know, even more productive, if you can be more impactful, if you can be, you know, better well-being through working in a place like this, why wouldn't your company offer it? Well, of course, one of the challenges is tax. We know that. But I think I do see this being a huge opportunity for so many people in the future. And either they may want to move to places like this permanently, or maybe they just want to get a taste for it for a couple of weeks or months. But either way, I think the days of just going on a holiday or vacation for 1 week and that's it, those days are over, because we're all in high pressure jobs. We're all drained, and we basically go on holidays. And by the end of maybe the first week, we're already only starting to recover. But if you can tag along a couple of weeks work from anywhere into that, where you maybe take one day's holidays and maybe a week or two work from anywhere, work in that location for a couple of weeks, well, think of the transformation that that's going to offer to so many of us. And also the opportunity from an intercultural perspective, not just being in a location for just dipping in and out, but being able to really get a feel for the people, for the food, the culture, for the place on a much deeper level. And for me, I see such an exciting opportunity. And that's why for me, I do think that we've had the domestic remote work revolution. I see the international remote work revolution coming towards the second half of this year. But before we get to that, a couple of things I want to tackle around the tax side. This is us in Malaysia, in Penang, actually. They have beautiful street art. This is when we were traveling around Asia. We spent 6 months living there back in 2018. But in terms of the myths, this is one example. This is just a tweet. I had a look on Twitter yesterday, and this is just one tweet from this guy, Alex Napier, Holland. He said, I still see nomads say, if you keep moving and don't stay anywhere for 6 months, you don't have to pay any income tax. And he said, it's probably the worst fake news in the nomad scene. And I have to say, I agree 110%. What's really interesting is, you know, pre-COVID, for a lot of countries, you could go in and you could do what's called the visa runs going in and out. But one of the challenges we're seeing now is that for a lot of countries, what they've done, like everyone else in business and in life, is they have digitalized the visa and immigration processes. So think of, for example, the e-visa in India, for example, but they've also digitalized many of the tax databases. Not every country, there's still a lot of countries are paper-based, but a lot more of them are digitalizing those processes. And it's only a matter of time. In some cases, this is already happening where that one database speaks to the other. And if that happens, and you're doing a lot of visa runs, something like this is going to pop up. And plus as well, it's not necessarily the same number of days in every country. It really, really depends. So you've got to watch out for that. I think as well, it's in some cases, in some countries have one kind of a tax system for the whole country. Think of Ireland, for example, whereas other countries, it really depends and varies state by state. So in the case of, for example, the US, not many people actually know and appreciate it, but there's 12,000 state and local tax jurisdictions across the US. So this is one aspect that it really depends in many cases, even the state that you're in as well. So something to be aware of the difference between the federal and the non-federal tax systems. The next one I think is worth talking about is the 183-day myth. A lot of people think, oh, if I'm only there for under 6 months, it's fine. But the problem is in some countries, it's only just barely 30 days. In other countries, it's 365 days. You need to be aware of the days in different countries. And in other countries, yes, the days come into it, but they have other definitions. They look at your center of vital interest. So they don't just look at the days, they look at, okay, what other things have you got with an attachment to that country? It could be the bank account, it could be your house or whatnot. So I think it's important to recognize the days alone is only just one aspect of it. That's why we call it the 183-day myth. And this is just an example. One of the challenges we found is tax is one of the biggest pain points. So we developed a free tool basically to allow people to put in the country that they're tax resident in, and basically then put in the number of days they want to go abroad. And you can see here, in this case here, you can see some countries all of a sudden are red, some are green. In the case of Thailand, for example, they have 179 days. Whereas, for example, in the US, the residency days are 31. So it really depends on the countries that you're going to. You need to be very, very conscious of that. But then if we take a look, okay, there's some of the myths, and feel free to give some feedback in the chat if there's any other ones that you're aware of and to contribute to the conversation. But what about the big risks? What are the big ones to watch out for? Well, we recently did a Work From Anywhere white paper where we surveyed over 110 companies around the world who employed over 2.7 million people and various different roles, global mobility, HR, finance, and tax. And essentially we asked them, what are the biggest risks or the biggest challenges? And they more or less told us it's the biggest, like the compliance challenges of specific countries is the one that jumps up, as well as people leaving the company if we don't offer some element of work from anywhere. And if you look at that and tap into that for a second, I think it's important to understand for you, if you're managing a startup, particularly if you have any kind of scale, if you're like more than 10 or 20 people, understanding which countries are a no-go and which countries are green and which cases are orange. Like for example, take if one of your employees says, I want to go remote work in North Korea. Well, I'm sorry, you can't get a visa. There's a massive individual tax risk. There's a huge corporation tax risk. And by the way, our data privacy and security, the standards aren't good enough there. Cuba, for example, Cuba is on the Russian network, for example, so your data isn't secure there. In other countries, they can be very strict on corporation tax, like, for example, India. Also, China has a wide definition of how they interpret permanent establishment. So understanding which countries are a green and which countries are a red is absolutely vital. If you let your employees, or if you yourself work in a country that's high risk, you're going to have a problem. Thomas, would you mind just putting yourself on mute if that's okay? I think there's a bit of feedback coming from that. In terms of the big risks, there's a couple of major ones to highlight. The biggest risk, and it's going to come, probably is no surprise to a lot of you, is corporation tax risk. And you might ask me, well, John, why isn't individual tax coming up for companies as one of the biggest risks? Well, the reason is, in terms of the risks, for me personally, it's always going to be individual tax. But for your company, it's actually going to be corporation tax. And let's tease that out. Let's say me as an individual, I remote work in France for, let's say, 6 months or 7 or 8 months, and all of a sudden I become tax resident there. And let's say I forget to pay my taxes. Well, the company could be fined maybe 50,000 euros. I myself might have to pay some fines or interest payments, whatever it might be. But it's not going to be more than, let's say, for argument's sake, 100,000 euros. But take that same scenario. Let's say I'm in a very high risk role, for example, like I do a lot of sales or whatnot, and I'm a senior director, and there's others doing something similar. And let's say I'm working in my house in the south of France. If the French authorities determine that there's a thing called permanent establishment, which is basically corporation tax residency, so residency for my company in France, then all of my profits, all of the revenue that I've had in France and the profits attributed to those can be taxable in France. And you can imagine, if you've got like a 10 million sales or 100 million sales, and all of a sudden they become taxable in France, well, the tax rate in France, it's likely to be significantly higher than your home country. So that's why, for example, corporation tax is a much bigger headache to deal with. So I think being aware of that is critical. And how that's kind of defined is it really very often is a mixture of how long you're spending there, and also typically the role that you have. So if you're in a high risk, what's called a high risk role, which can be like a senior director, or if you do a lot of sales, for example, there are other factors. We have a definition of it on our blog. But if you're in those situations and you trigger that risk, it can be a huge pain. So then how can we manage these different risks? Well, we've put together a work from anywhere framework, a kind of a compliance framework to help people deal with the risks, because it's not just the tax risks, it's also the talent risks that, if one of your employees leaves the company. So for you as an individual, if you're working for a company and they're being very difficult on implementing a work from anywhere policy, there's a big risk that for you, if it is important to you, that you're going to leave. And we're already starting to see that in many cases. But it's a case of weaving not just the tax, but also the immigration, employment law, and visas, and insurance, and duty of care against those risks. But I do appreciate that for most people here on the call, it's more individual tax. So I won't spend too much on that. What we have done, which you'll find helpful, and for anyone who's working for a company that is saying, we don't think this is possible, well, we have put out an open sourced free white paper. It's non-commercial. There was no advertising in this. It's available for everyone to access freely on the website, so that you can give this to your HR team or your global mobility team, that they can see what is possible and what companies are doing, basically. So there's some very useful insights on that, on how to manage the big risks. It's a short version of the white paper we've produced now. We will be producing a longer one over the next few weeks. And to give you some very practical examples of it, this is a great quote from one of the leading KPMG partners on this globally. She said the biggest risk is saying no or doing nothing at all. You don't really want to leave the door open to implied permission or the loss of great talent. So what I've done is in the white paper, we've given very practical examples of how you can approach this, and we'll be teasing that out in the longer version of the white paper over the next few weeks. So again, it's not just about individual tax risks, it's also corporation tax risks. Other things that are very important, both for you as an individual and for your company, is to watch out for is a thing called contractor misclassification. And what exactly is this? Well, basically, a lot of companies mistakenly thought in the past that, if you want to hire somebody in a country where you don't have a legal entity, let's just use and hire them as a contractor. But the problem is in some countries, they're very strict on this. And they say, if you're actually working just for that client, well, then we're going to treat you as an employee, and you have to have all the tax deductions and other deductions that go along with that. So that's one to watch out for. But you can find in some cases that using an employer of record can also be another solution worth thinking about as well. It is country specific, to be fair, but there are some very interesting solutions emerging here, and more than happy to answer any questions. You'll have my details after the webinar, so more than happy to answer any questions anyone has on that. I think also it's not just about tax, also the data privacy and security side of it. But there are solutions here. For example, I know this isn't tax, but again, we're seeing a lot of best practices here. This is one, for example, the National Cybersecurity Index. So if you're looking to go to a country, and you can see that it's low risk from a tax perspective, and they come back to you and they say, we're worried about data privacy and security. Well, here you can come back to them with a very practical resource of how risky that country is according to the NCSI, let's say. So then I just want to double check any of the questions in the meantime. I know I'm almost finished it, but I want to just see if there's anything else. I can see here. That's the access to the paper. That's great. That's perfect. Okay, great. So in terms of managing the big risks, there's a kind of 4 different ways to tackle this. So for either you as an individual, if you're trying to make the argument to your company, or you are trying to manage it for your startup. The first option is to set up an entity in the country you're looking to do a lot of remote working in. That can be expensive. And if it's just for you, it probably doesn't make a huge amount of sense. You can either set up an entity or a branch, but it tends to be expensive. Why? Because you've got to do all the annual reporting and all the relevant tax deductions and reporting in that country. Another option is to hire as a contractor. So you can hire somebody or be hired as a contractor. Again, you've got to watch out for countries that have a big risk for contractor misclassification. The next one, as I said earlier, was actually hiring via an employer of record. There are some fantastically successful companies in this space, such as, for example, Deal, such as remote.com, and a few others that are very, very interesting. You also have digital nomad visas. So digital nomad visas, not all of them are the same, but some of them, for example, they allow you to work in that country and not pay any income tax. You just have your income tax deducted in your home country. So depending if you, on the basis that you don't have any major complexities and you're no major corporation tax risk for your company, that can be a really, really good option, or for you as an individual, let's say. But you have got to watch out, because you've got to make sure you don't do any major capital gains disposals or anything like that, because just because they don't charge you income tax doesn't mean they won't charge you, for example, let's say capital gains tax or other taxes. So that's there are some potential things to watch out for there. But in any case, you've got a balanced view of a few different options of how you can manage the different risks. And that's basically it. There's some of the things I wanted to go through, and I'm conscious there's always a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I'm conscious of any questions any of you have, and please feel free to let me know any feedback or questions. More than happy to answer.